Hi, in this recording we're going to be talking about two different decision-making phenomenon in groups, groupthink and groupshift. To start off talking about groupthink, groupthink is one of those things that every organizational behavior course covers, and it's very important to consider because if you can prevent it, it can really help your groups be more effective. Groupthink has to do with when a group has pressures within it to be to conform, and then so what happens is, even though individuals in the group might have differences of opinion and might question what the group decision seems to be, overall the group kind of prevents those differences of opinion from really getting to be reflected on in the group decision, and so the group overall just kind of works towards one decision without truly considering alternatives. And so, as you might notice, this talks about something that happens at the group level. So it may be that you might be a part of a group and you might question to yourself, just within your own mind, what's going on. That's not really talking about groupthink. It's not what's going on in your individual mind. It's what's happening overall in the group. Is the overall group, even if there are some people quietly thinking or even slightly voicing their opinions, is the group as a whole just kind of barreling towards some decision without really reflecting and considering alternatives? If that's happening, that is groupthink. And there are multiple examples of this in history. The Bay of Pigs is thought of as one, the Challenger disaster with NASA and space. And I'm going to use a different example just to give us some variety. And this is an example that comes from a friend of mine who's working at a hospital as a director of marketing. And he was part of a committee where they came together and they were making a decision whether to spend a lot of money to hire a consultant to train everyone in the hospital, all the people that were working in the hospital, to think like business people. So to train like the doctors and the physician assistants and nurses and all, to try to think like business people so that they could make decisions that reflected business more so than they were. They were doing much more of a more medically oriented decisions. So that's what they were trying to decide on. And so, as my friend described, it really became groupthink because he was thinking to himself, this doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's a lot of money for something that seems questionable. And do you really want doctors kind of pushing aside some of their medical training for this? And so, but nevertheless, the group kind of just pushed ahead and didn't consider fully different viewpoints of people on this committee. And so that was an example of groupthink. So let's take a look at some of the symptoms of groupthink to see how this works. So one of the symptoms of groupthink is to rationalize resistance. So in the case of this committee at this hospital, there are people who were bringing up some questions and saying, well, is this a good idea? Or have we thought about this? And so when someone would bring that up, they would say, well, but you don't really understand. You're really just coming at it from a marketing perspective. Or, you don't understand the big picture. We have these pressures that we have to meet some bottom line kind of goals. And so it's really important that we do this. So you don't have the full view. So we really can't consider what you're saying. So that's kind of rationalizing the resistance, saying like the resistance is not valid because somehow they don't really get the whole picture. And so that kind of then pushes the group towards one way of doing things. Then secondly, applying pressure on those who question or doubt group conclusions. So this is where, let's say that they do have this kind of a discussion where their resistance is rationalized. And then when it comes down to moving ahead on actually plowing ahead and doing this, they might say, well, we've got to do this, so let's just put all that aside and let's go ahead and move ahead and adopt this and hire the consultant. Or maybe when someone does question something, they can say, well, under some circumstances that might work, but we really need to meet these goals, so right now we need to put that aside. So these are forms of pressure where people are feeling like they have to just kind of work towards what the group as a whole wants them to do. And then another symptom is where people end up keeping quiet. So as it turned out, my friend later talked, after they'd already hired the consultants and some time had passed. When talking to some people later, they said, oh, I really thought it was a bad idea, but I just thought maybe it didn't make sense for me to voice that opinion. Or I thought about it, but I was didn't have the energy to really fight that fight. And so being quiet about the differences that they have in opinion is also a symptom of groupthink. And then lastly, this kind of illusion of being unanimous. So this is where you're not unanimous, but somehow you might force it. You might say, okay, well, even though there's been maybe some people who are questioning, you say, it sounds like we're all on the same page. Boom, and you move ahead. So that's like really kind of a little bit of a false perception, but or something along the lines of, okay, let's all think about this from the perspective of this goal that we need to reach. From that perspective, doesn't this make sense? Oh, it does? Okay, great, let's move ahead. So again, pushing ahead on an agenda that maybe is really truly not what everyone really believes in, but they are creating that illusion. Now, what can you do to prevent groupthink? Well, sometimes in larger groups, because of the social loafing phenomenon in part, and because people are not as accountable, larger groups tend to be afflicted more with groupthink than smaller groups. So keeping your group size from getting too large can be helpful. Also, having impartial group leaders. So what that means is you want to have a leader who doesn't start off a meeting by stating his or her opinion. You want a leader who shows that he or she is really open to different perspectives, doesn't have an opinion already, isn't trying to push some agenda right from the beginning. So you want a group leader who's going to be really open to what group members might say. And along those same lines, that group leader and the group as a whole should really seek input from all group members. If someone's quiet, then ask for their opinions. Maybe even have a structural kind of process where you're going through and everyone has to say something. So that way you make sure that everyone has a chance to state their input. There also can be room for using the idea of a devil's advocate. So if it seems that there's maybe some decision that the group is coalescing around, you can institute that, say that someone has to play the devil's advocate, or maybe a couple of people are. And so you say, okay, if we're going to play devil's advocate, what that means is let's try to come up with another perspective or come up with arguments for why this current decision might not be the best idea. So you're just kind of putting into place some sort of way of questioning what a group decision might be. And then lastly, discussing diverse alternatives. And you can do this by, for example, breaking a group into smaller subgroups and maybe having different subgroups consider different alternatives. Another way of doing that is breaking the overall group into subgroups and discussing different parts of the issues. Like for the hospital example, maybe one group is looking at it from a patient's perspective, another is doing it from the doctor's perspective, another from the marketing perspective. So trying to come up with different alternatives and perspectives can be a good way of preventing groupthink. Now, in terms of group shift, which is another group decision-making phenomenon, I have a couple of slides here, 2 slides that show kind of different parts, different scenarios with group shift. What happens with group shift is you can imagine that there's a group that has to make a decision, and so the individuals within that group, in this case are individuals A, B, and C, that those individuals think about what they would decide if they just individually were coming up with a decision. So if their decisions on this continuum ranging from conservative to risky tended to be a little bit more on the risky side of things. So let's just say that they're trying to decide how many people to accept to a university, and these are individuals on an admissions committee. And so conservative would be, let's not accept that many. Some of these are kind of borderline. Going more risky would be, let's accept more of them. They seem like, they could rise to the occasion. So let's just imagine that individually, without consulting each other, individuals A, B, and C are all slightly on the risky side between conservative and risky, but just a little bit on the risky side, right over the edge of the midpoint. If group shift occurs, what happens is the individuals might have these ideas on their own, but then when they come and they meet as a group and they have a discussion, if group shift occurs, the group decision moves in a more extreme direction, in the direction that the individuals were already leaning. So in this scenario, the individuals were leaning a little to the risky side. If group shift occurs, the group decision then moves to a more risky side. So they're shifting as a group. Their individual, what would have been just on their own opinions, ends up being more risky and more extreme, which in this case is more risky. And so why does this occur? Well, part of it has to do with this accountability idea that when you are in a group, you can kind of hide a little bit more, and so you're not accountable for the decision as much as you would be if you were just being asked on your own what you thought. And then also sometimes people think that in this kind of scenario that you hear different reasons why you might be, in this case, risky in your decision. And so when you hear other reasons why riskiness could be the way to go, it kind of just justifies going more risky. And so that ends up, for those reasons, you end up shifting as a group to a more extreme direction. Now if we move to another scenario, because I don't want you to think this is only shifting in a risky direction, group shift is about shifting to a more extreme position than you would as individuals. So here's the scenario, kind of going the other opposite direction, where individuals D, E, and F were more on the conservative side of the spectrum, maybe deciding if it's a college admissions committee to not accept some individuals to a college. And then when they meet as a group, they end up shifting in a more extreme direction. They were already leaning conservative, they go more conservative. Like, we can't accept any of this particular group of people we're looking at. So again, keeping in mind, it's the individual's tendency that sort of starts the process, but then it's really only group shift once the group moves in a more extreme direction, in the direction that the individuals were already leaning. So this is something is important to be aware of and to think about and to try to guard against by in a group, if you are having sort of people are kind of seeming to coalesce into extreme positions, to sort of stop and think about some of the things we talked about with group with groupthink, where you can play devil's advocate, where you can try to make sure that you're thinking about different perspectives. Thank you for listening.